Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today I'd like to begin talking about the year 1969 with particular emphasis on the Beach Boys' February 1969 album release, 2020. 1968 had been a rough year for a lot of people, not least of all the Beach Boys, who had the worst year of their career up to that point. Their June release of the Friends album, great album though it was, had largely been ignored by the record-buying public. The album only went to 126 on the chart. That August saw some more releases from the Beach Boys. There was a Beach Boys Greatest Hits Volume 3 album. There was the very odd Stack of Tracks album released in August of '68. And there was a single, Do It Again, which went to number 20 on the chart and provided a minor hit for the Beach Boys. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but I had this feeling that there's been sort of a revisionist view of the Do It Again single, that it was like the second coming and saved the Beach Boys or something. I mean, it did well. It went to number 20. At the beginning of the year, Darlin' had gone to 19. A year earlier, Heroes and Villains had gone to 12, and of course, the fall of 1966, a year and a half earlier, they'd been at number 1 with Good Vibrations. So a 20 showing is a good showing, but it seems to me that over the years this has been turned into this massive single. When I look at what the chart placement was and see that it only went to 20, the way they talk about it, you'd think this thing had been some massive hit that had just blown the doors off. Anyway, it's a good song, but somehow it seems like there's been a little revisionist history on that. Anyway, end of that digression. In December of 1968, the Beach Boys released another single, Bluebirds Over the Mountain. This one didn't do nearly as well as Do It Again or Darlin'. It only went to number 61 on the charts. That brings us to the year 1969. Where were we as a nation in February of 1969 when the Beach Boys released the 2020 album? Of course, 1968 had been a very difficult year for a lot of reasons. We had the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in June. There were riots at the Democratic Convention, riots throughout the country. Very, very difficult year, very divisive, polarizing presidential election with a narrow victory for Richard Nixon. There was an uplifting moment at the end of 1968 when the crew of Apollo 8 became the first to ever orbit the moon. And on Christmas Eve, while orbiting the moon, they read passages from the book of Genesis to what was at that time the largest television audience ever. January 20th, 1969, Richard Nixon was inaugurated 37th President of the United States. And where were we pop culturally as 1969 got underway? In visual media, as it had been for the last few years, the watchwords were color and impact. Of course, we had pop art, we had op art. The psychedelic paintings of Peter Max had become massively popular. You can see this look reflected in the Beatles animated feature film Yellow Submarine, released in November of 1968 and still playing in theaters when 2020 was released in February of 1969. Other feature films popular early in 1969 included Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand, which had been released the prior fall but was still playing to good business. The psychedelic sci-fi of Barbarella, starring Jane Fonda, which had opened in October of 1968. Steve McQueen in Bullet, a big Christmas release from 1968. The film version of the musical Oliver. And in kids' fare, you had Disney's The Love Bug in limited release, going into wider release in March of 1969, starring Dean Jones, Michelle Lee, and Buddy Hackett, and of course, Herbie the Love Bug. And Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, starring Dick Van Dyke, Sally Ann Howes, and Lionel Jeffries. In movies, color was king. The last black and white features had happened a couple of years earlier with things like Hard Day's Night and Dr. Strangelove. From here on out, using black and white for a feature film was a stylistic choice. Likewise, color TVs had given rise to garishly colored television shows to show off to the owners the capabilities of their new sets and to get any black and white holdouts to spring for that big new color console. Television was a carousel of color as 1969 began. And what were we watching on those new color sets as 1969 began? By some distance, the highest rated program in the country was NBC's Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which was now in its third season. It seemed in some way to exist in the nexus between the burgeoning counterculture and established show business, and would remain popular into the early 70s. The second highest rated show was Gomer Pyle, USMC. Apparently, the American public couldn't get enough of tuning in to see the furious Sergeant Carter berating the moronic Gomer Pyle. Third rated was the long-running Western series Bonanza, followed by Mayberry RFD. Early 1969 must have been a great time to be Andy Griffith. He owned two of the four most popular television series in the country, and he had Jim Nabors and Ken Berry to do his heavy lifting. He could be out fishing with Opie. Andy Griffith had it made in 1969. Following that, high-rated shows included Family Affair, with Sebastian Cabot as Mr. French, the long-running Snooze Fest, Gunsmoke, a new series, Julia, following the comic travails of a nurse and single mother. Another new show with a nod to the counterculture was the Mod Squad, following the adventures of Pete, Link, and Julie. Also, premiering in January 1969 was the Glen Campbell Good Time Hour, starring former touring Beach Boy and session musician Glen Campbell. Glen Campbell was also having an extremely good year. His album Wichita Lineman would unseat the Beatles' White Album from the #1 spot in February of 1969. His show, the Glen Campbell Good Time Hour, would run until 1972, and in June of 1969, he opened in the hit film True Grit, starring opposite John Wayne. Another notable new series was Irwin Allen's Land of the Giants. Being an Irwin Allen series, it had a very limited budget for special effects. They had very few of the needed giant props. They had a giant hand, a giant telephone, giant pencil, a giant camera, a giant pad of paper, giant books. So a lot of the action with the giants seemed to take place always on desktops. Another sci-fi series, Star Trek, was winding down its 3-season run. A few weeks after the release of the 2020 album, they would air the infamous Way to Eden episode, also known as Space Hippies, which gave new meaning to the phrase Herbert, Herbert, Herbert. There were two musical specials on TV in December of 1968, which spawned hit albums in 1969. The first of those was TCB, which stood for Taking Care of Business, starring Diana Ross and the Supremes and the Temptations, produced by Laugh-In producers George Slatter and Ed Friendly. That album, the original soundtrack of TCB, actually unseated the Beatles' White Album for 1 week early in 1969 from the #1 position. Beatles' White Album returned to #1, and then a week later was unseated by Wichita Lineman from Glen Campbell. The other musical special aired the night after TCB on December 3rd, 1968. It's come to be known as the Elvis Comeback Special. However, the actual title was just Elvis, or the Elvis Singer Show, since Singer's Sewing Machines sponsored the program. This soundtrack from that program was also high on the charts in February 1969 when the Beach Boys released their 2020 album. What else was in the chart in February 1969 when the Beach Boys released the 2020 album? From the prior fall, you still had Jimi Hendrix's double Electric Ladyland album, containing his one top 40 hit, a cover of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. That was followed in April of 1969 with the release of Jimi Hendrix's Smash Hits album. Timepiece, the Rascals' Greatest Hits, had also been released in the fall and was still fairly high in the chart in February of 1969. Of course, the dominant album since its release at the end of November 1968 was, not surprisingly, The Beatles, which quickly became known as the Beatles' White Album. It's a great album, of course, everybody knows it. It's interesting, though, to remember that as a follow-up to Sgt. Pepper, this was initially greeted as something of a come-down. There was some thought that the Beatles had compensated with quantity over quality in releasing such a sprawling double album. There was also in some quarters a feeling that the Beatles were getting a little out there. Technically released in November of 1968 was an album that a lot of people heard about, but at the time very few people actually saw in a store. And that was the infamous John and Yoko Two Virgins album, in which John Lennon appeared nude on the cover with someone other than his wife, a shocking thing, particularly in 1968. In December 1968, after a long feud about their own album cover art, the Rolling Stones finally released Beggar's Banquet in what was basically a plain white sleeve, having lost their battle for the album cover art that they wanted. This white sleeve, drew unfavorable comparisons once again to the Beatles' White Album cover, which had been released just a few weeks earlier. A couple of greatest hits albums were doing really well at the time 2020 was released. There was Donovan's Greatest Hits and The Association's Greatest Hits. As I mentioned, the Beatles' animated film Yellow Submarine had been released in November, and the soundtrack from that film, Yellow Submarine, was doing well in the charts, though it only contained 4 new Beatles songs, and they were not prime Beatle material by any stretch of the imagination. Of course, even not prime Beatle material is pretty good, so this was high on the chart. Other major hit albums released in December 1968 included Stevie Wonder's For Once in My Life and the self-titled Blood, Sweat and Tears album, which would produce hits well into 1969. Another album released late in 1968 didn't hit the chart heights of those albums, but was very influential. Switched on Bach by Walter Carlos featured Bach numbers played on a Moog synthesizer. It really captured the spirit of the times with its futurist attitude. With the promise of the moon landings coming up, we thought we'd soon be off to other planets, we'd be living under the sea, have flying cars, moving sidewalks, robot maids, really be living the Jetsons lifestyle. Switched on Bach seemed like the perfect soundtrack for that life. Meanwhile, back in January of 1969, Creedence Clearwater Revival released their Bayou Country album with their first major chart hit, Proud Mary. In February of 1969, right around the time 2020 came out, Cream released their Goodbye album, and shortly after went their separate ways. The power blues void left by Cream was filled by a band that had been for a while called the New Yardbirds, who had released their first album under their new name, Led Zeppelin, in January of 1969, and of course would go on to become one of the seminal bands of the 70s. On the singles chart, you had Everyday People by Sly and the Family Stone, which later in the year would become one of the major tracks on the Stand album released in July of 1969. Touch Me by The Doors was also high on the chart, and that summer would become part of the Soft Parade album. Also on the charts, you had Crimson and Clover by Tommy James. You had one-hit wonders Brooklyn Bridge with The Worst That Could Happen and Build Me Up Buttercup by The Foundations. So this is the eclectic world that the Beach Boys found themselves in early 1969 when they released the 2020 album. Of course, we've run out of any time to talk about this time. I'll go over it track by track when we meet again in the next episode. I hope you found this interesting. I'd like to give some background. Please like and subscribe. Love to hear your comments. Let me know if there's something that I left out or something that I got wrong. Love to learn more about this stuff. Thank you. Till next time. Bye.